Hey everyone, Whiskey here, and welcome to Harp and Guitar, People and Music. I want to thank my good friend Monk Music for opening up this channel and starting things off on the right note, if you will, with his first video on some of the practical applications of blues music and blues theory. And what I wanted to do today for my part was just give you fellas a little bit of an introduction to sort of the role that I'll be playing here on this channel, Harp and Guitar, People and Music. I'm going to sort of dive in and take you on kind of a journey back in time and further down the road to the south, the southern United States. And throughout this journey we're going to be visiting places like Clarksdale, Mississippi, and West Memphis, Arkansas, and we'll head over to Georgia and Texas, Nolens, head up into St. Louis, Missouri, and then of course to good old sweet home Chicago. I'll also be discussing a lot of the influential people, famous artists and maybe not so famous creative talents that have helped to shape this music. Bring it from its early seed, the early seed that was planted in the South around the turn of the last century, the late 1800s and early 1900s, when this music evolved from simple field hollers and work songs and train calls and these sorts of things, and a lot of these traditional tunes were sort of meshed together with the proper classic European music structure, and over the decades it transformed itself into what we now call modern blues. But it had a very humble beginnings by a very humble and downtrodden people, the African American in the South, and actually some poor whites in the South, as I mentioned, through the late 1800s and early 1900s, farmers and sharecroppers and slaves and former slaves. And the blues music was a way of them to communicate and to explore ideas. But unfortunately, because of the restrictions in their travel and in the things that they could say and do, a lot of times they were left no choice but to deliver these messages through song undercover with double entendre. If they were being mistreated by an overseer on the plantation, it's not like they could sit down on their back porch at night after a hard day's work and sing songs about how terribly they were treated by their overseers or the plantation owners and masters. So oftentimes they would get a sense of relief, sort of get things off of their chest, and the way they did this was through personal song, but they coded the messages. Often in the blues we hear things like, oh my baby, I love you, but you treat me so bad, you take all my money and you give it away to another man, and these sorts of themes. And more often than not, really what they're talking about, they're singing about their woman, but really what they're talking about is their boss man, and how the boss man is treating them and members of their family and their community. And as I mentioned, these early forms of self-expressive singing and writing songs over the decades evolved and eventually spread out throughout the Delta and through the southern United States, sort of from east to west, from what is commonly referred to as the birthplace of the blues, down in the Mississippi Delta, and in and around Louisiana and Georgia, Alabama, East Texas. And these themes traveled eastward and westward, and then eventually up northward as well, as I mentioned earlier, into St. Louis and Chicago. Now we're not only going to be exploring some of these themes and some of the places that blues music has gone throughout the decades, but we're going to also be exploring some of the colorful characters and artists that helped give birth to what is now commonly referred to as the original American musical art form, the blues. Um, there are many famous people, very many famous names out there that so many people around the world are familiar with. Gentlemen like B.B. King, Muddy Waters, of course my man here, the Howlin' Wolf, Buddy Guy, Son House. A lot of you out there are very familiar with names like this, but we're also going to be talking about a lot of unsung heroes, a lot of men who were an influence to the more famous names. A lot of people are familiar with Robert Johnson, but maybe are not familiar with Robert's influences and how he grew up, and some of the artists and musicians that he crossed paths with throughout his years as a musician and a recording artist and a rambler, and basically what eventually became known as really a blues superstar. He became quite famous in many circles throughout the U.S. In his time while he was still alive. And these are the sorts of things that we're going to dive into, and it's going to be an incredible and interesting journey, and I hope that you find it fascinating as well. And once again, I want to thank my good friend Monk Music for allowing me this opportunity to share some of these ideas and these stories with you about some of the famous and not so famous men of the blues. So thank you very much, and thanks for joining me. We'll talk to you again real soon, fellas. Thank you.